Night over the Solomon Sea, July 13th, 1943. Midnight. The Pacific was so still it looked like glass, black and bottomless. The only light came from the dim red glow inside the bridge of USS Keeling, where radar screens pulsed like a heartbeat in the dark. 5 contacts, said Ensign Cooper, his voice tight. Bearing 145, range 16,000 yards, closing fast. Captain Frank Iron Jack Mallory stood with one hand on the chart table, the other wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. His face was half in shadow, eyes fixed on the glowing dots creeping closer. He didn't need the radar to know what they were. The Japanese destroyers moved in formation, fast, clean, silent. Kajiro class, maybe Yugumo. Each one carried torpedoes that could reach farther than any American gun. If they broke through, they'd gut the convoy behind him. 6 transports loaded with Marines bound for New Georgia. "Orders, sir?" asked his XO, Lieutenant Fraser, nerves showing in his clipped tone. "Admiral's signal says maintain defensive line. Hold position." Mallory didn't look up. "And when those long lances hit the convoy?" Fraser hesitated. "Then we return fire." "Return fire?" Mallory said quietly. "We're supposed to wait until they've already fired?" "That's doctrine, sir," Mallory exhaled slowly. The radar hum filled the silence. Somewhere below deck, a crewman coughed, the kind of sound that carried when everyone was trying not to breathe. He looked through the bridge glass at the horizon. The enemy wasn't visible yet, but he could feel them. He'd been fighting in these waters since Guadalcanal. He knew how the Japanese hunted. Coordinated, silent, merciless. And he knew what happened to men who waited for permission. A flash split the horizon. Muzzle fire, distant but unmistakable. The next sound came a second later, the hollow thunder of naval guns. Shells whistled overhead, vanishing into the black. "Shells landing short," shouted Fraser. "They're ranging us." Mallory turned toward the helmsman. "Helm, right 15 degrees, bring us broadside." Fraser blinked. "Sir, that puts us out of formation." Mallory's voice was calm, cold. "So?" "Sir, we're understanding orders to protect the transports. We break line, we lose coverage." "We stay here, we lose everything." Fraser swallowed. "Admiral's gonna hang you for this." Mallory smiled faintly. "Then I better give him a good reason." He grabbed the intercom. "All stations, this is the captain. Prepare for offensive actions. Load full AP, target radar bearings 145 through 165. We're going hunting." For a heartbeat, the bridge went still. Then the gun crews roared into motion. Steel hatches slammed. Shells clanked into breaches. The ship came alive like a beast shaking off its chains. "Helm hard starboard," Mallory ordered. "Engines ahead flank." The Keeling's hull shuddered as her turbines screamed to life, cutting a wide arc through the water, breaking away from the defensive screen, breaking orders, breaking every law of naval formation. The first officer muttered, "Sir, this is insane." Mallory's jaw tightened. "No, Lieutenant, this is math. They're expecting us to wait. We don't." The ship sliced into the dark, her wake a silver line across the Black Sea. On radar, the enemy formation adjusted. They'd spotted the movement. Mallory leaned over the scope, eyes narrowing. "They think we're retreating." Fraser frowned. "Aren't we?" Mallory smiled thinly. "Not yet." The radar operator's voice cracked. "Range 10,000 and closing." Mallory pointed toward the horizon. "All guns, on my mark." Silence. Then, as another flash split the dark, he said it. "Mark." The Keeling's forward turrets opened fire, thunder ripping across the water. The shells vanished into night. A heartbeat later, the horizon lit up. Orange blossoms where 2 radar blips had been. "2 hits," shouted Cooper. "Jesus, they're burning." Fraser turned to Mallory. "You just fired first, sir." Mallory's grin was a shadow in the red light. "No, Lieutenant. We just fired right." Outside, the Pacific was no longer calm. Fire danced on the horizon, and the 30-minute war had begun. Every navy builds its commandments. Theirs was simple: hold the line. Destroyers weren't meant to chase glory. They were the shields of the fleet, fast, thin-skinned, and expendable. Their job was to protect the heavy ships, not to think for themselves. The doctrine of 1943 demanded obedience above all else. The captain who stayed in formation was disciplined. The one who broke it, even to save lives, was reckless. Captain Frank Mallory had been fighting that rule since Annapolis. He joined the Navy in an age of battleships and parade formations, where admirals still thought wars were won by geometry. To them, formation meant safety, a neat, visible line that told every gun where to point. But the Pacific had rewritten the geometry of war. The sea was too wide, the radar too new, the enemy too fast. The old logic was cracking. Still, the orders never changed. Convoy screens were sacred. If one destroyer left the perimeter, the convoy was exposed. And exposing a convoy was worse than losing a ship. It was disobedience, betrayal of the chain. Mallory had seen men court-martialed for less. He remembered one night off Guadalcanal, a captain who chased an Echo on radar without clearance. Turned out it was real. He'd sunk a Japanese cruiser. The next morning, he was relieved of command. He endangered the formation, the report said. That phrase haunted Mallory. Endangered the formation. Not the men, not the mission, the formation. It was worship of the line, a god that ate its own believers. On the bridge of USS Keeling, Mallory had a different creed. Formations don't win battles, he told his officers during drills. Situations do. Some of them believed him. Others thought he was half-mad. But every time they ran radar exercises, they shaved seconds off their firing time. He taught them to fire blind, by bearings and range alone, to trust math instead of eyesight. The Navy said it was unsafe. Mallory said it was evolution. His crew called him Iron Jack not for his temper, but for his calm. The way he stood motionless when everything else was chaos. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The men followed because he was always right just a little too early. The irony was cruel. He was being punished for preparing for the war they were already in. When orders came to defend a convoy off Colombangara, he read the operation brief and muttered, "We're bait." 5 destroyers were to form a screen, hold formation, absorb whatever came. Fraser had frowned. "Admiral says we hold no matter what." Mallory folded the paper. "Then we hold. Until that stops working." He wasn't defiant by nature. He simply understood something the manuals didn't, that the enemy had read the same doctrine. The Imperial Japanese Navy knew exactly how Americans fought. They'd studied formation discipline, intercepted convoy frequencies, and used it against them. They'd strike from angles the doctrine said didn't exist. Obedience had become a liability. And Mallory knew that if he didn't adapt, he'd be sending 300 men and 6 transport ships full of Marines to the bottom of the Pacific. Every captain had a choice: trust orders or trust the ocean. The ocean didn't care about orders. It only cared about who moved first. So when the radar showed 5 destroyers cutting across his bow that night, Mallory made his decision in one heartbeat. He broke the law of formation, not to rebel, but to survive. To every admiral, it would look like insubordination. To every sailor on deck, it looked like salvation. Because the truth of naval war wasn't in the manuals or the lines drawn on maps. It was written in water, fluid, unpredictable, and always favoring the man who refused to stand still. By mid-1943, the Pacific was an ocean divided by fire. The Americans had clawed their way out of the disaster of 1942, but the victory at Midway hadn't ended anything. It had only shifted the killing zone south toward the Solomon Islands. Every inch of ocean had become a trap. Every night was another chance to die quietly under black water. The U.S. Navy called it the slot, the narrow corridor between the islands where Japanese destroyers ran supply and attack missions under cover of darkness. The enemy called it Tokyo Express. To the men who fought there, it was hell that came with a timetable. The Keeling was part of Task Group 31.3, a handful of destroyers tasked with screening convoys that brought Marines and munitions to New Georgia. Their mission: keep the supply line alive. But by July, the Japanese had adapted. They moved in wolf packs, small coordinated squadrons striking at night with the best torpedo ever built, the Type 93, or Long Lance. It could travel more than 20,000 yards at speeds that radar barely caught. American captains learned the hard way that by the time you saw one, it was already too late. The Navy's solution was defensive doctrine. Convoys moved in tight formations, destroyers positioned in a crescent ahead, screening the slower transports. Radar would provide early warning, and heavy cruisers behind them would provide long-range cover. It sounded perfect in meetings. It fell apart in the dark. Radar, still primitive, worked better for detection than precision. Torpedoes didn't care about doctrine. And in the narrow confines of the Solomon Channels, formations weren't shields, they were targets. The Imperial Navy's commanders, masters of night fighting, turned those American formations into shooting galleries. In a single month, June 1943, the Allies lost 8 destroyers and 3 transports in nighttime ambushes. Every after-action report said the same thing: formation maintained until destroyed. Mallory had read those reports with disgust. He was a pre-war tactician, obsessed with gunnery math. Before the war, he'd been stationed at Pearl Harbor as an instructor, lecturing on predictive fire control. He'd argued that radar could be used not just to see the enemy, but to lead them, predicting their paths and striking first, unseen. The admirals had laughed. Destroyers defend, cruisers attack. That's the order of things. Now, that order was collapsing. The sea off Kolombangara was the proving ground. American convoys had to push through to supply landings on New Georgia. Every night, Japanese destroyers came hunting. The Keeling was assigned to the rear of the defensive screen, the safe position. But Mallory hated safe. Safe got men killed. He'd spent months training his crew to fight blind, firing by radar bearings alone, without visual confirmation. He'd had them run drills where the lights stayed off, and the only voice on the ship was his, calling numbers. Bearing 150, range 12,000, guns 1 and 2. Fire. The first few times they missed everything. But by the 5th week they were hitting floating barrels dead center. The Navy said it was a waste of fuel. Mallory called it preparation. So when his radar man, a kid barely 20, called out 5 contacts, 16,000 yards, Mallory didn't hesitate. He didn't need permission to do what he'd spent a lifetime training for. The enemy's formation moved in a perfect line. Textbook. Until they met a man who didn't read textbooks. Mallory's defiance wasn't a whim. It was an answer to a doctrine that no longer fit the war it claimed to fight. The admirals back at Pearl still saw the Pacific as a chessboard. Mallory saw it as a knife fight in the dark. And that night he decided to stop playing defense. The Navy had taught him how to protect a convoy. The ocean had taught him how to win one. War on the sea was math written in metal. You didn't fight enemies, you fought numbers. Mallory knew the math of that night was hopeless. 5 Japanese destroyers against 1 Keeling. They were faster, better armed, and could throw more steel farther than any U.S. gun on his deck. Each enemy ship carried 10 Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes, 50 weapons, each capable of reaching 22,000 yards, 12 miles, moving so quietly they left no wake. At that range, the Japanese could kill you before you ever saw them. The Keeling's own Mark 15 torpedoes, 10,000 yards maybe, if the sea was calm. The 5-inch guns on deck could throw shells about half that far. The textbooks said, "Don't engage." The textbooks had never met Frank Mallory. He didn't think in torpedo ranges. He thought in seconds. How long before the first enemy salvo reached his position? How long before his radar gave him firing solutions? How long before the convoy behind him was torn open? He sketched the engagement in his head. 5 destroyers moving northwest at 30 knots. The convoy crawling at 12. Distance closing fast. That gave him 12 minutes before the torpedoes hit. The doctrine said, maintain formation. The math said, you're dead in 12 minutes. Mallory trusted the math. He walked the bridge with calm precision, tracing an invisible line across the chart table. If they're moving at 30 knots and we flank east by 30 degrees, they'll have to adjust bearing. That costs them time. Lieutenant Fraser frowned. You mean to split off? Not split, cut across. If we angle right and charge, we shorten their firing window. Sir, that's suicide. Mallory smiled. So's waiting. He pointed to the radar display where the 5 blips glowed like eyes. Their advantage is range. Ours is data. We can see them, they can't see us yet. That's all I need. He turned to the gunnery officer. Range to nearest contact? 14,000, sir. Mallory nodded. At 30 knots, that's 90 seconds before they're in torpedo range. Fraser's voice was tight. We're too slow to run. Then we don't run. We dodge the math. He tapped the radar. They think the ocean's their board. Let's tilt it. In truth, Mallory was gambling on something no admiral had yet trusted. Radar-directed gunnery. American destroyers had the SG radar, a miracle of electronics that could track a target in total darkness, measure its bearing and distance to within 50 yards. The Navy used it to warn. Mallory used it to kill. His idea was blasphemy in 1943. Fire without sight. The old guard said it violated every law of naval combat. Mallory said it violated every rule of dying. He did the calculation in his head. At 20,000 yards, the enemy torpedoes needed 50 seconds to reach him. His radar could provide firing data in 12. His gunners could cycle every 4 seconds. 50 seconds of survival. 12 to strike first. 4 between each salvo. The math balanced, barely. He could lose the ship, but if he stayed in formation, he'd lose 6 more behind him. He turned toward Fraser. Engines ahead flank. Bring us 30 degrees starboard. We'll cut across their torpedo lanes before they can lock range. Fraser hesitated. That's against orders, Captain. Mallory looked at him with a ghost of a grin. So's getting ambushed twice. The ship began to turn. Her bow carved white foam across the Black Sea, slicing through doctrine, slicing through history. Numbers filled the radar screen. Distances fell. Bearings adjusted. Mallory didn't blink. Range 12,000, said the radar operator. 10,000. 9. Mallory lifted his hand. Fire control. Prepare to lock all forward turrets on bearings 145, range 8,000. Fire on radar solution. The gun captain hesitated. Sir, we don't have visual confirmation. Mallory's tone was razor flat. You have my word. The guns thundered. Shells screamed into the night. The radar operator whispered, Impact. Impact confirmed. 2 hits. Mallory nodded once. Good. Load again. In those seconds, the math of the war changed. The enemy had range. Mallory had timing, and timing was about to erase tonnage. The Pacific was a living thing that night, flat, black, and breathing. You could feel it through the deck plates, through the vibrations of the engines, through the rhythm of the guns as they fired into nothingness. The Keeling moved like a ghost, cutting through her own smoke, and the pounding surf at 30 knots, chasing shapes her crew couldn't see. Enemy destroyers turning toward us, shouted the radar man. They're lining up for torpedo launch. Mallory's hand gripped the bridge rail, knuckles white. Helm, full rudder right. Cut across their spread. The helmsman hesitated. Sir, that'll take us straight into... I know. Do it. The Keeling heeled hard, water exploding over her bow. Men on deck grabbed railings, cursing. She turned straight into the vector of enemy fire, the exact move no sane captain was supposed to make. Lieutenant Fraser stumbled against the bulkhead. "Sir, if those torps hit—" "They won't," Mallory snapped. "They aimed for where we should be." He stared at the radar screen, watching the 5 enemy destroyers spreading out like the claws of a hand. He saw their torpedo wakes, faint lines on the sea moving fast. The old Navy would have turned away. Mallory was cutting through them. The radar man's voice cracked. "Torpedoes in the water. Range closing. 6,000, 5,000. Mallory raised his hand. "Guns, fire all forward batteries. Bearings 150, 152. Rapid fire." The ship's guns roared. Tracers carved invisible arcs into the black. Each shell followed coordinates, not eyesight. For 20 seconds, the crew saw nothing. Only the scream of their own ordnance. Then the first explosion ripped the horizon open. A tower of fire bloomed where the lead destroyer had been. "Hit confirmed," shouted the gun captain. "Direct on target." Mallory didn't react. His eyes stayed on the radar. "Next contact, bearing 158. Adjust elevation 2 degrees. Fire." The Keeling fired again. Another detonation. Fraser's voice trembled. "Sir, we just hit 2 ships we couldn't see." Mallory's tone was calm as stone. "That's what radar's for." The sea answered with violence. Torpedoes passed beneath them, one close enough to rattle every bolt on the hull. The Keeling bucked, water hammering her side. Alarms screamed. Someone yelled, "That one was close." Mallory just muttered, "Close doesn't count at sea." He leaned forward. "Helm, bring us 10 degrees left, cut inside their line. We'll flank the survivors before they recover." It was a move that defied every manual. You never turn toward a line of torpedoes, never close distance with destroyers carrying heavier guns. But Mallory wasn't fighting ships anymore. He was fighting their assumptions. The Japanese formation was in chaos. 2 of their destroyers burned. Another had slowed. The remaining 3 adjusted course, trying to reload. Mallory pounced. "Target nearest crippled vessel, bearing 165. The Keeling's guns spoke again, their thunder echoing off the water. Shells found their mark, detonating near the waterline. The 3rd enemy destroyer vanished in flame. Fraser stared at the inferno. 3 down. 30 minutes ago, we were supposed to hold formation." Mallory's voice was low. "Now we are the formation." He turned to the radar man. "Where are the last 2? "Bearing 180, retreating, speed 28 knots. Mallory's eyes narrowed. "They're running." Fraser hesitated. "Sir, orders are to regroup with the convoy." Mallory said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Helm, pursue." Fraser exhaled. "That's a direct violation. So's letting them get away to kill someone else." The Keeling surged forward. The smell of cordite filled the bridge. The radar pings became steady again. 2 blips, bright and desperate. The first blip flickered, then split. 1 ship turned back, a feint. The Japanese commander was trying to lure Mallory into an ambush. Mallory saw it instantly. "They're crossing their own wake. They'll fire into their own spread if we hold course." He smiled grimly. "Hold course. Sir? Let them kill themselves." Seconds later, 2 massive flashes lit the horizon. The enemy destroyer's own torpedoes had found their sister ship. 1 blip vanished. The other drifted, burning. Mallory's voice was quiet now. "All batteries, cease fire." The bridge went silent except for the ringing in their ears. Fraser whispered, "That's 5. 5 ships, Captain." Mallory finally turned from the radar. 5 ships, 30 minutes. Outside, the ocean burned in long orange streaks, reflecting off black waves. The crew watched in stunned silence as the last Japanese destroyer slipped beneath the surface, taking doctrine with it. For the first time that night, Mallory allowed himself to breathe. He looked out over the horizon and said softly, "Tell the convoy it's clear." Fraser hesitated. "What should I tell command?" Mallory smirked faintly. "Tell them we followed orders, just not theirs." By 0045 hours, the Pacific had become an inferno. The water burned with drifting fuel slicks, tracer rounds still hissing as they hit the waves. 5 enemy destroyers lay broken across 15 miles of sea, 3 burning, 2 gone completely. The air smelled like diesel, blood, and scorched metal. Radar sweeps returned nothing now but echoes of debris. Every new blip was a corpse. On the bridge, the silence felt unnatural. No one spoke for a full minute, the kind of quiet that comes only when men realize they've survived something they shouldn't have. Then the XO finally said it. 5 ships in 30 minutes. How the hell do we even write that down? Mallory didn't answer. He was watching the horizon, black against black, his own reflection caught in the glass. He murmured almost to himself, "You don't write it. You just remember." Below deck, the engineering crew cheered. Men hugged each other, some laughing, some shaking, not yet believing. The ship had fired 300 shells, spent half its ammunition, and hadn't taken a single direct hit. The Keeling was battered, but intact. Fraser leaned over the radar console. "No more contacts. Convoy's safe." Mallory finally turned. "Then we've done enough." "Sir," Fraser said carefully, "Command's not going to see it that way." Mallory raised an eyebrow. "You mean they'll court-martial me for winning?" Fraser's voice dropped. "They'll call it insubordination. You broke formation, disobeyed orders, exposed the convoy's flank." "Flank's still here," Mallory said. "Convoy's still afloat. That's all that counts." He looked at his hands, rough, trembling slightly. "The ocean doesn't care about chains of command. It cares about who acts first." Below, the gun crews reloaded in silence, their faces still lit by the faint glow of fires on the horizon. Each man understood without saying it. They'd done something that wasn't supposed to be possible. Fraser finally said what everyone was thinking. "You realize, sir, you just changed everything." Mallory turned toward him, eyes unreadable. "No, the war did. I just caught up." He moved to the intercom. "Damage control report. All systems operational, Captain. We took some near hits, but no penetrations." Mallory nodded. "Good. Tell the men to stand down. Keep watches tight. We're not out of the woods yet." As the adrenaline began to fade, exhaustion settled in. The crewmen slumped against bulkheads, breathing hard. The first aid station treated only minor burns and a broken arm. For a destroyer that had just fought 5 ships alone, it was a miracle. Fraser broke the quiet again. "You realize what you just proved, right? That one ship, with radar and nerve, can outfight a squadron." Mallory's tone was distant. "I didn't prove it. The math did." Outside, the ocean's surface glowed red and gold with burning oil. The sea was no longer black. It shimmered with ruin. Every ripple carried the sound of metal collapsing beneath the waves. Somewhere in that vast darkness, Mallory imagined the faces of the men on those enemy ships, captains, just like him, following their doctrine to the letter. They had done everything right, by the book, and they had died for it. He whispered quietly, "Perfection kills faster than any torpedo." Fraser frowned. "Sir?" Mallory turned away. "Nothing. Just thinking how many men die following orders." For the first time that night, a sense of guilt hung in the air. Victory at sea was never clean. It was just math that worked in one direction. Mallory stared at the flames again and said softly, "They'll rewrite the manual after this." Fraser tried to lighten the air. "Maybe they'll name a maneuver after you." Mallory almost smiled. "Then they'll have to forgive it first." Above them, the stars reappeared, cold and bright, indifferent to the smoke rising from the horizon. The ocean began to calm again, hiding its dead. The Keeling drifted slowly, engines cooling, her decks lit faintly by the glow of her own victory. Mallory looked out over the black water and said the only words that fit. 30 minutes, he whispered. That's all it takes to change a war. 2 weeks later, in a conference room on Espiritu Santo, the smell of coffee and damp uniforms replaced the smell of cordite and diesel. Commander Frank Ironjack Mallory sat before a long oak table with 4 admirals behind it, men whose shoes had never touched a wet deck. Their ribbons gleamed like a row of stoplights. Admiral Stevens, the senior officer, didn't look up from the report. Captain Mallory, you are aware of the charges against you? Mallory's reply was calm. Yes, sir. Unauthorized engagement. Violation of standing orders. Reckless endangerment of convoy assets. Stevens nodded. Good. Saves me from reading it aloud. The admiral beside him, a younger man with glasses, tapped the report. You left the defensive screen, Captain. You abandoned your assigned sector, engaged a superior force, and risked the lives of over 1,000 men in the convoy. Mallory's eyes didn't waver. Yes, sir. Then you admit the facts? Yes, sir. The admiral leaned forward. Then explain this part, if you would. 5 enemy destroyers sunk. 0 convoy losses. How? Mallory's voice was even. I used radar offensively. Closed the range. Fired by bearing before they could acquire us. One of the admirals snorted. Impossible. No ship can engage accurately without visual confirmation. Mallory glanced at him. Then maybe you should see what the Keeling can do. The younger officer bristled. You defied orders. I followed results, Mallory said. A low murmur passed around the table. Admiral Stevens finally looked up. His voice was slow, heavy. Captain, do you understand what you've done to our doctrine? You made radar gunnery look like instinct. If every skipper starts doing that, the fleet turns into chaos. Mallory met his gaze. Respectfully, sir, the enemy already fights with chaos. We just started catching up. Stevens' expression didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered. A hint of admiration, buried under bureaucracy. He leaned back, fingers steepled. You realize if we commend you publicly, we condone breaking formation. But if we punish you, we bury a victory. Mallory nodded once. Then you've got the same choice I did. Sir? Doctrine or survival? The room went still. Outside, a rain squall hit the tin roof like gunfire. Finally, Stevens closed the file. You'll receive a formal reprimand for record. No court-martial, no commendation. Mallory gave a thin smile. Half a punishment for a full success. Stevens stood. You think you're clever, Captain? Mallory rose slowly. I think I'm alive. And so's the convoy. The admiral studied him. You know, off the record, you've just forced every man in this room to reconsider how we fight. Mallory didn't flinch. Then I did my job. As he turned to leave, Stevens called out, Captain? Mallory paused. Stevens' voice softened. If I were 10 years younger, I might have done the same. Mallory's eyes met his. Then I hope I made you proud, sir. Stevens smiled faintly. You made me nervous. That's better. Mallory walked out into the humid island air, the world suddenly bright and ordinary again. Outside the building, his XO Fraser leaned against a jeep, cigarette in hand. Well? Mallory climbed in beside him. They gave me a reprimand. Fraser exhaled smoke. That's what they call victory now? Mallory looked at the sky, gray, endless. It's what they call change. Back on the Keeling, the crew had already painted 5 small silhouettes of destroyers beneath her bridge windows, quiet proof of what official reports wouldn't say. In Washington, the Navy Board buried the incident in a classified appendix. But 2 weeks later, radar gunnery training manuals were updated with a new phrase: offensive radar solutions permissible under independent command discretion. Mallory's disobedience had become policy. No medal, no ceremony, just a line of text in the doctrine he'd broken. It was how revolutions in warfare always began: quietly, bureaucratically, and far too late. By the autumn of 1943, whispers of the Kolombangara engagement were spreading through the fleet like contraband. Nobody could print it, nobody could quote it, but every destroyer captain in the Pacific had heard the rumor. One ship broke formation, charged 5 destroyers, and won. Officially, the Navy never named the man. Unofficially, they called the move the Keeling maneuver. It started showing up in after-action briefings. If radar contact indicates an advancing surface group, captains may, under extreme conditions, initiate offensive counteraction. That sentence, buried in Section 8 of the revised Tactical Handbook, was the Navy's quiet confession. It was Mallory's maneuver, sanitized into policy. On paper, it sounded clinical. In practice, it was revolution. Destroyer captains began experimenting with radar triangulation in mock engagements, turning doctrine on its head. Convoy defense shifted from rigid geometry to mobile aggression, screens that attacked instead of waited. The Pacific War started to bend around that logic. By early 1944, in the battles of Vela Gulf and Empress Augusta Bay, American destroyers used those same tactics to annihilate Japanese squadrons. Fast, invisible, radar-guided strikes, just like Mallory had done that night. The Navy called it initiative. Mallory called it common sense. But back aboard the Keeling, he kept quiet. The crew had grown superstitious about fame. They'd seen men get medals and disappear into staff jobs. They preferred to keep their ghosts at sea. Mallory stood on the bridge one evening, the sun bleeding red across the horizon. His XO Fraser joined him, holding a folded piece of paper. "Dispatch from HQ," Fraser said. "Revised tactical bulletin. They've made it official." Mallory raised an eyebrow. "Made what official?" "Your maneuver." Mallory took the paper, scanned the lines, and smirked. "They took out the part about me breaking orders." "Of course they did," Fraser said. "Can't make disobedience standard issue." Mallory folded the paper carefully. "That's the Navy. They bury the truth and call it evolution." Fraser hesitated. "You should be proud, sir." Mallory stared out at the horizon. "Pride doesn't float. Ships do." Below deck, the gun crews painted fresh silhouettes for new kills earned in later skirmishes, small Japanese flags beneath them. The Keeling had become the ship that refused to die, the one that moved before the order came. Word reached the Admiralty again months later, reports from other captains now replicating Mallory's approach, with devastating results. One after another, enemy destroyer groups were destroyed before firing a single torpedo. At a staff meeting in Pearl Harbor, an aide remarked, "It's like they're fighting ghosts." An older admiral, the same Stevens who once reprimanded Mallory, replied, "No, they're fighting a man who stopped asking for permission." By the spring of 1944, the Keeling doctrine was an open secret. Radar-controlled gunnery became standard practice, and destroyers were finally recognized as independent hunters, not just escorts. The war's balance shifted. The Imperial Navy's night advantage, their long-range torpedoes and flawless coordination, began to crumble against radar-guided aggression. In the archives, the official summary of the Kolombangara action remained brief. One U.S. destroyer successfully engaged multiple enemy vessels using radar-directed fire control. Enemy losses, 5 destroyers. Allied losses, none. No names, no mention of disobedience. But every man who'd fought in those waters knew. Every time a destroyer broke formation to strike first, every time a radar operator whispered new bearings into the dark, that was Mallory's ghost at the helm. Fraser said it best years later in a letter home. They gave us rules to keep us safe. Mallory gave us permission to win. The doctrine had changed, but the man who caused it never took credit. He didn't write books, didn't give speeches. He just sailed, fought, and waited for the next horizon. Because for Mallory, victory had never been about rewriting history. It was about proving that sometimes the only way to save a fleet is to stop being part of it. The war had moved on, but the sea never forgot the night the Keeling broke from its line. For months, Mallory's name drifted through the fleet like a rumor sailors whispered between watches. Some called him reckless, some called him a genius. All of them knew he had done the impossible, rewritten the rules of the ocean with a single turn of the rudder. The Navy had always been ruled by doctrine, not intuition. It prized obedience, not imagination. The formation was sacred, the manual infallible. But the Keeling's 30-minute war exposed the truth. The sea didn't care about hierarchy. It only cared about who moved first, who fired first, and who was left floating when the horizon turned red. In the Pacific of 1943, leadership was measured not in medals, but in decisions made without permission. After the Kolombangara engagement, the Admiralty tried to contain the story. They redacted names, rephrased orders, buried the disobedience under bureaucracy. But even silence couldn't kill the idea. The Keeling maneuver spread like a ghost current, unseen but felt everywhere. In training manuals, the phrase radar-directed independent action began to appear. Captains learned to trust their operators. Gunnery officers learned to shoot what they couldn't see. It was quiet evolution, masked as procedure. But in the mess halls, it had a name. Pulling a Mallory. For men like Mallory, that was enough. He never wrote a report about that night. He didn't need to. The wrecks of 5 destroyers had already done the writing for him. Historians would later call it a tactical anomaly, a lucky strike made possible by overconfidence on the enemy's part. But the men who'd been there knew luck had nothing to do with it. It was nerve, instinct, and math, the 3 forces that had always governed survival at sea. And yet, for all its brilliance, Mallory's act remained a paradox. He had saved lives by breaking orders. He had defended a convoy by abandoning it. He had obeyed the spirit of command by defying its letter. That paradox became the soul of modern naval warfare. Because after the Keeling, initiative became a weapon. Officers who once feared punishment now acted without waiting. Convoys arrived faster. Casualties dropped. The Pacific, for the first time in the war, began to feel like something the Americans could control. All because one man decided the math of doctrine no longer worked. Mallory's personal log, declassified decades later, held a single line about that night. Doctrine is what keeps you alive until it kills you. The ocean doesn't read orders. He never saw himself as a rebel. To him, the illegal maneuver wasn't defiance. It was survival refined into geometry. But to every man who fought after him, it became something more. Proof that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the refusal to let rules outpace reason. In the end, Mallory's 30-minute war had done what no admiral's decree ever could. It turned obedience into intelligence. It gave the Navy permission to think. And though the official record would never say it outright, every captain who turned his ship toward danger instead of away from it owed something to that night. Mallory's victory didn't just save a convoy. It saved a generation of sailors who learned that initiative wasn't mutiny. It was mastery. The law of the sea had changed forever. And somewhere in that quiet expanse of black water where doctrine once drowned, the echo of his voice still lingered, steady, calm, and certain. Helm, hard starboard. Engines ahead, flank. After the war, Commander Frank "Iron Jack" Mallory returned to a world that no longer needed destroyer captains. The Pacific was calm again, the ships decommissioned, the sea suddenly smaller. He moved into a small house near San Diego, 1,000 miles from the waters that had once defined him. To his neighbors, he was just another quiet veteran with an easy smile and a limp that came from nowhere he'd ever talk about. He taught navigation at the academy for a while, though his students never knew the full story. They only knew the legend, the Keeling maneuver, the nameless captain who'd changed doctrine in 30 minutes of madness and brilliance. When someone asked him about it, he'd just shrug. "You do what the ocean tells you," he'd say. "That's all." But those who'd served under him remembered every detail. The fog, the radar hum, the calm in his voice when he told them to break the line. To them, Mallory wasn't a maverick. He was a teacher in a storm, showing them that courage wasn't loud. It was calculated. One of those sailors, now an old man himself, once said, "Mallory didn't fight the Japanese that night. He fought the rule book. And he won." In 1955, when the Navy quietly declassified parts of the Kolombangara action, Mallory's name appeared in the appendix, a footnote in 12-point type. Commander F.J. Mallory, USS Keeling, executed unauthorized offensive action resulting in enemy losses, 5 destroyers. No commendation, no medal, just proof he'd existed. He read it once, then folded the paper and filed it away. He didn't need a medal. He'd seen his proof floating in firelight across the ocean 20 years earlier. When he died in 1962, his service flag was folded and handed to his wife. His logbook, a small, salt-stained journal, was found among his things. On the last page, one sentence was written in his precise handwriting. "A good captain doesn't break orders. He bends them just enough to win." It was the closest he ever came to explaining himself. Decades later, when naval historians began studying early radar warfare, Mallory's engagement became a case study in tactical innovation. The very maneuver that once earned him a reprimand was now part of officer training courses. Young captains studied his diagrams. They called it aggressive independent action. The rest of the Navy called it instinct. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The illegal move that had nearly ended his career had ended up saving thousands of others. Out at sea, where the light fades and silence falls, sailors still tell stories about captains like him, men who trusted their own pulse over the printed page. They say that when radar lights up the dark, when the decision comes too fast for orders to matter, there's a voice that echoes from somewhere deep in history, steady and certain. The voice of a man who turned the tide by ignoring the map. It says, "Don't wait for permission." And somewhere beyond the horizon, where doctrine ends and instinct begins, the ocean still carries the memory of the Keeling, slicing through black water. One ship against 5, rewriting the laws of war in 30 minutes of impossible courage. Frank Mallory never became an admiral, never got the medal he deserved. But the fleet that came after him bore his fingerprints. Every captain who broke formation, every ship that trusted its own radar, every act of initiative that saved a crew. That was Mallory's legacy. He didn't change the war by following the rules. He changed it by proving that victory belongs to the ones willing to disobey the impossible.